started out, you raced the car for Rockham with Bill Champion.
Mm-hmm.
He was your uncle, was he not?
No, no, he was a friend of mine's. We all grew up in a neighborhood, kind of a fairly tight little residential neighborhood. And Linda, my wife, she lived down the street. This was when we were 10 years old, 12 years old.
Huh.
And behind her was a guy named Cliff Champion. All lived in the same little neighborhood. And Cliff Champion was Bill Champion's cousin, second cousin.
Okay.
So that's kind of how that connection got made. And Cliff was a volunteer helper, as my brother was, on Bill Champion's cars back in that day, early day. They were probably in their teens at the time as well.
Right.
And that's kind of how that got started. And Bill was just, he did all he could with the money he had to work with, but it was more of a start and park type operation in its day.
Right.
Same thing as Richard Childress, a very similar deal. And a lot of guys made their living doing that during that day. But I think Bill saw that he was getting tired, physically tired, and I got a chance to drive his car, and that's kind of how I got started.
Why did your family take up racing?
Well, my family started racing. There's 5 kids in my family, one brother and the rest were sisters. And when I came along, I was next to the youngest. So my dad had raced local tracks around the northern part of Carolinas on the coast, Wilson, dirt tracks, and all kind of places around the Norfolk area. He raced with a guy named Joe Weatherly and Bill Champion in that era. And Joe Weatherly went on to become, Cup champion later on. But they all sort of raced in that area. And then my dad got married and started having kids. And then I think my mom put it to him, we'll have kids and we stay married, or you can get rid of that race car and help, raise these kids. And so he did the smart thing at the time. He had a lot of kids coming, and back then money was hard to come by. So it got to the point, I think, groceries or we can go race. And and I think my mom kind of put the law down to him. So my dad had a background in like local racing, and that's probably where it started. But I can remember being 9 years old going to professional go-karts races, very structured, very organized, and learning how to race at 8 years old. And the things were fast. Later on, we'd run over 100, 120 mile an hour on these go-karts. So speed was I had things I was afraid of, but speed was not one of them.
Huh.
And I think just early karting days,
Yeah.
You talked earlier about getting in the car the first time and kind of it being an eye-opening experience. How long did it take you to feel like, okay, maybe I do belong here after all?
Let me see. I think my career was 30 years long, and about 30 years, before you feel comfortable. No, it just took seat time, a lot of seat time. These kids today, they're pretty amazing. There's a lot of talent out there. But I've always thought that and knew that kids at a young age could have the but have the ability to drive a race car fast. What hurt a lot of guys in my era, when I came along, I was 18. The next youngest guy was probably in their 30s, just the way the system worked. These guys would go, they run local short track races, they run your Hickories and Langley Fields and places like that. And then they work to become track champion or, run successfully on that local level and hoping that they can draw sponsorship. And then eventually they can move on to the big leagues of the Cup division. But it was very few guys really made it because it was so expensive. But at that time, it took these guys a pretty good time age-wise. They already aged before they got there. So I'm 17, 18 years old. Next youngest guys are in their mid-30s. And I was like a fish out of water. I didn't fit in, didn't have a place there. But I knew the main thing I had to do is just, don't cause any wrecks. Be smart, get your seat time. And I did. I just paid my dues and paid attention and got a little bit better, a little bit better. And then I think it was like 160 races before I won my first race. But I think just it took a lot of track time. But these kids today, they're running 900 horsepower midgets at 12, 13 years old.
Yeah.
So they hit the leagues here on NASCAR now, even a Cup level, and they're capable of running up front. They got to learn the routine and stuff, but they're very capable. But the biggest difference between now and then, and I would say it probably took me longer to learn to analyze what the race car is doing. So back in our era, you were the computer. You were the guy behind the wheel. And I learned a lot from a guy, he's long gone now, James Hilton. He would get in my car when I go to the Cup races, and he would get him to shake it down, make sure it's doing what it should be doing. He said, yeah, it's doing everything. Just go out there and get some seat time. But he described it to me as you can't go out there and run 100% in practice. Go run 90%. Come in, and now you can debrief with the crew chief and tell him what the car is doing, what it needs to do better. He said, if you're running 100% in practice white knuckled, you're not going to know the feedback to give the crew chief. So a good part of that curve was just learning how to give information so the crew chiefs can make the adjustments to make the car better. Well, now you don't have to worry about that. You know, your computer, they got testing, they got simulation models. So now these guys get in these cars. That's eliminated all that track time that's necessary to learn how to debrief with a crew chief. Yeah. They don't have to worry about that now. So it's a different league right now. It's a whole different sport.
Junie Donlavey was your first full-time team owner.
Yep.
We all know he's a Virginian too. But how did that come about?
Well, I'm trying to think how that did work. Dick Brooks was a driver for Junie for quite a few years. Yeah. And Junie was in Richmond, which was about 100 miles from where I grew up in Chesapeake. And I think the way we got, I'm trying to think how this worked. I think Junie needed a driver, and I think we agreed to help pay the tire bill, something like that. It was some kind of, Junie had to have money to come in and operate. But he did it. He had a very good operation with all volunteer help. And it was a really neat place because these guys were there because they wanted to be there. You know, it wasn't because they had a day job, but they'd come in at night. Junie had opened a shop about 5 or 6 at night, and they worked about midnight every night. And so all that volunteer help that came from the day jobs were, machinists, quality machinists, and brilliant people. But I got a chance to drive for Junie. And the very first time we show up at a racetrack, I think we go to Daytona, and I come in off the racetrack and I grab a creeper. I'm going under the car. We knew we needed to change some shock absorbers, so I'm going under the car to help change shocks. And Junie come up. I think he might have grabbed me by the feet and eased me out from under the car. I said, "Yeah, Junie, what's going on?" He said, "Bubba, go over there and sit on the back of the truck." He said, "We got guys that can change these shocks for you." I said, "Well, I'm always used to helping. We were always short of help. I don't know if I drive a car that I change shock absorbers on, really, but somebody had to do it. But Junie had people that could do it. So, but Junie, when I went to Junie, I'd only raced 2 or 3 short NASCAR short tracks. We just didn't run many of them then. And so Junie was a coach as much as he was a car owner. He would get on top of the truck and he said, he had radios and, you need to get a little deeper in the corner. You need to brake with your right or left foot, switch over and trail brake. And basically a driving instructor, Junie helped a lot of people to get around the racetrack better.
So I'm in the process of scanning all the old Grand National scenes. Actually, I've scanned all the Grand National scenes now. So it's funny to go back in time and look at some of the stories. And I remember one in particular where you actually went to drive for a guy by the name of Nelson Malloch. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then you left Nelson Malloch pretty quickly. And the reason in the paper was the car just wasn't safe.
Yeah.
And for a car not to be safe back in that era...
Yeah.
I know about this car.
Just how unsafe was that car?
Well, it was good equipment, but even good equipment, you got to change parts. There's a lot of preventive maintenance that has to happen. Well, they were based in Ohio. As a matter of fact, Dick Brooks drove that car some, and I seemed like I was following Dick Brooks around. So when Dick Brooks stepped out of it, and that car was available, I should have told you something right there. But I don't want to beat these guys up. They did what they could, what they had to work with, but they were racing out of Ohio, and it was just like 2 guys working on this car, so they had to be wore out. So I can see why the parts didn't get changed. But we broke a ball joint at Talladega, and the car was running okay. The car was pretty quick. They had good motors, but it actually broke a ball joint, which Moog chassis parts gives you ball joints. And everyone before a speedway race, you're supposed to change them. And they actually, at that time, the tech inspection, they made you show that you changed the ball joints. You had to have papers showing you x-rayed or magnaflux all the suspension parts. Well, I had one of the officials call me off to the side a little bit after that. He said, "Rick," he said, they had their paperwork. He said, "But I can tell you, those parts weren't changed on that car. There's grease left on the car parts from the last race. When you magnaflux them, you got to clean everything up." He said, "It wasn't." He said, "They had their paperwork, but he said, I wouldn't." And then we ended up breaking a ball joint. That's when we run 200 mile an hour and I broke a ball joint. Basically, just take the steering wheel, pitch it out the window. It doesn't do anything when you break a ball joint. You can't steer it. So it was a wake up call. So I said, as bad as I want to drive, I can't. I got to step out of this car before it hurts somebody. Hurts me.
How did the infamous DiGard situation arise? Now we know that Daryl fought tooth and nail to get out of that deal, which he did.
Yeah.
And they had something available, of course, in 1981. Why did they approach you? Or did they?
I was cheap. I drive for food. Back in that day, you had to pay people.
Yeah.
And that's pretty much where they didn't hardly pay me anything. But, it wasn't really hard to figure out. I could go drive for DiGard, which everybody, I knew that it was a one-sided contract, and it wasn't. You didn't have to be a rocket scientist to learn that. I was getting myself into paperwork that wasn't very complimentary. But I wasn't doing it for the money. I was doing it for experience. And at that time, Daryl had just stepped out of the car, so and Robert Yates was building motors. So there were some things at DiGard. The team itself was a solid team when I went for them. They weren't like cutting back at that point, and Gatorade was a sponsor. I think I signed like a 10-year contract, making literally, like 10 or 15% of the purse. Back then, 40% was pretty the standard. So anyway, it wasn't about the money. It was about seat time. And Jake Elder was going to be the crew chief over there. And Robert Yates building motors. It wasn't, it was a pretty good place to go. So I could either do that, or I could go back, and my delivery spot at Al Rudd's junkyard was still available. I've probably been head of delivery. Head of deliveries. I'd have gone and stayed with my dad, because he was, I think he moved up. He had 2 delivery trucks then. So I'd have been head of deliveries at Al Rudd's Used Auto Parts. So it was that or go drive for Gatorade, So I said, well, it's not real hard to figure this one out. So, but about the same time it happened by accident, we go to Charlotte Motor Speedway, and that's a story in itself. I'm not going to bore you with the details, but basically we had a family-run car right before the DiGard. That's what got the DiGard opportunity going. Was there's everybody in our little group that had raced. We won Rookie of the Year as a family operation, and it wasn't everybody had day jobs. They worked around the clock at night, but everybody was tired. We won the Rookie of the Year, so basically everybody physically couldn't go on like that. So the team pretty much came to an end. So we had a Monte Carlo that was built by Banjo Matthews back in the day, a good race car. It was sitting there in the shop. 1980, we're into 1980, and I think I just left that Nelson Malloch deal. So Linda and I were living in Norfolk, Chesapeake, and we ended up moving to Charlotte, North Carolina. We got an apartment, a 1-bedroom condo, an apartment in downtown Kannapolis. And we carried that race car with us. Linda, my wife, went and got a job. She was working in the ticket office selling tickets at Charlotte Motor Speedway. And then DK Orvich was my brother-in-law at the time, had a nice shop right next to the Speedway. So basically we carried that Monte Carlo up there. It was just pretty much me and Linda. She worked a day job, and I worked, whatever you had to do to get the race car ready. And we carried it over to Charlotte Motor Speedway for the October race. They had a practice session a week before the official opening. So we went over there, and I was about 60 cars running. We were probably about 20th fastest on there in the cars that were there. And Harry Hyde comes walking through the garage area, and he stops at my car. And Harry was like a legend. I was kind of intimidated to even talk to him, but Harry stops and talks to me. So, wow, this is pretty neat. And he says, Ricky, if you don't mind, I'd like to look under your car. If you don't mind, I'll roll under there and see if I'd like to take a look, see if I can help you. He goes in there, spends about 10 minutes, comes back out, he's taking notes. He said, I see you're running pretty good. He said, but I see some things right here that I can help you run better. He says, I'd like to help you. I said, well, Harry, I appreciate it. I don't have any money. He said, well, take my car. If you want to do this, it won't cost you anything. We'll do it for nothing. He said, take that car over to across the street, which is the Rick Hendricks's complex today. And there used to be one building over there, and that's where Harry Hyde worked out of. So we bring the car over to Charlotte Motor Speedway across the street after practice is over. And I would go there and work on the car, getting ready, help work on it. Jimmy Maycar, who ends up being today, he runs Joe Gibbs Racing, but Jimmy was Rusty Wallace's crew chief back when he won the championship. So Jimmy was a young kid out of Delaware helping Harry. Randy Dorton comes over, and he's looking at the motor. Randy Dorton was the head engine builder at Hendricks forever, and unfortunately passed away in a plane crash. So I had superstars in their very beginnings helping to tune that car for the next week. And then Harry's up in there in the dyno room, and he's climbing on top of the motor, looking at it when they're running it on the dyno at full RPM. So anyway, we basically took that team, went over to Charlotte Motor Speedway the following week, and we qualified on the outside pole and finished third or fourth in the race. And that's what that one race opened the doors for the DiGard phone call to start happening. And then Harry came to me a little bit late, but he wanted, and I wished I'd have gone a different route, but Harry had found sponsorship, but it arrived like a week too late. I'd already signed a DiGard deal. Terry had a deal. He could run out of his shop. He found some money to run the team. But anyway, it was just a matter of fact, the pit crew that day was Dale Earnhardt's brother was he was a tire changer on the team. It was kind of a makeshift of everything, but it was a heck of a good put together operation for one race.
Now, I've always heard that I don't know if it was a lawyer's office or there at the shop at DiGard, but from what I understand, there was an incident, or not an incident, but there was a point where Darrell was coming out of a meeting, and you supposedly were sitting there, and he said, "It's all yours, kid."
Yeah, he said.
What was that situation?
It was a pretty quick deal. I think he was happy. He'd just gotten out of his contract, and I'm signing the paperwork, to get. I think he said, "Good luck," and something like, "You're going to need it," or something like that, because I was going in the office. It wasn't like you're going out the shop. You're going in the office to do paperwork. So, and that deal was really, what really hurt us on that thing was they downsized the cars that year to the They went from the big long, the big Bertha they called the car that Darrell won all those races with. So I wasn't going to get to drive. I actually only drove that car one race. And we went to Riverside, California, the first race with the old cars. You could run the old style or the new style. I went there to Riverside, California with and drove that Darrell's famous car, Bertha. And darn if we didn't qualify third and was leading the race with about 10 laps to go and would have won the race. Bobby Allison, we had Bobby covered that particular day. He ended up winning the race. We blew him over with like 9 or 10 laps to go. But that was the big car. Then after that, we went to the short cars, and even Jake Elder, one of the most famous crew chiefs in racing, he was everybody was stumped with that car because it was completely different than anything we'd run. And you got a fairly rookie driver driving this car. My feedback wouldn't have been as good as Darrell's, obviously. I mean, Darrell had a lot of seat time. So we were like, it was a hard year, tough year. Did okay, bunch of pole, tied Darrell for the most poles that year, I think, and never won a race, finished second and third, but never won a race. And so anyway, end of the year comes along, and DiGard, they got me so cheap, they wanted to keep me. This is before multi-car teams came along. So they wanted to keep me, and they brought Bobby Allison in, and I would have stayed there had it been under the same roof. But they were going to, basically, one of the start and park guys, they were going to farm me out to do a start and park. And they said, Bobby's going to only run about a year, and then we'll bring you back. You'll be seasoned, which, I said, hey, I'd rather take my chances on my own. Thank you, but no thank you. And it was going to be sticky, but I didn't have anything. They couldn't sue me. I had no money. So I said, hey, you can't make me drive this race car. And I'm just letting you know up front, I'm not driving that car that you got me farmed out to. I'll take my chances. And that's how the Richard Childress thing popped up. I was out of work. Here we are in January. Richard needed a driver. Greg Sachs got hurt in the Daytona test, about killed himself, and Richard needed a driver, and that's kind of how the Childress thing got started. If
you drove Bertha, I think you said one race.
One race. Mm-hmm.
Did you get to drop buckshot out of the frame rail?
No, Darrell didn't tell me about all that one either. I looked all over for that button. I could never find that thing.
So you. Go ahead.
Darrell said he only used it one time. Sure.
Yeah. That was, I can honestly say I never really came along when, I found out later, these guys had this and they had that and they had this. And I said, well, how do we even run on the same track with these guys? They're running 300 pounds light and we're not. And I don't know. It just, I look back now and, or maybe I was driving for teams later on and it was happening. I just didn't know it,
Well, of course, I know the story about Dale running those 11 races with RC, and then you come aboard the next year. How did all of that come about?
Yeah, well, the Richard Childress deal started, like I said, when I got my release from DiGard. And that didn't happen until like January, maybe it was December at New York. That's when it was. We went up to New York, and we met with the Gatorade sponsor, Bill Stokely, owned the Gatorade at the time. and he had some lawyers with him and stuff, and it might have even been on a conference call up there. Basically, when Bill Stokely, once he understood I wasn't going to drive, and he was real good about it. He said, "Well, we are not going to hold you to it. You know, we'll let you out of that 10-year contract, whatever it was." He said, "I don't think it's your best interest to stay put with this team right now." So he was real good about it. So I, Richard Childress either called me or I called Richard. Is when Greg Sachs got hurt in the winter testing at Daytona. So Richard calls me up, says, "Hey, Ricky, come talk to me. I'd like to have you maybe run some races for us." Greg got hurt, can't do it anymore. Of course, Earnhardt left and went to, at that time, he went to Bud Moore.
Yeah.
So, but Earnhardt left Childress to go to Bud Moore. But, they didn't, when Earnhardt came to Richard to first go around, I think it might have been in the middle of a season somewhere.
It was.
Yeah, and it was, Richard didn't have a chance to get cars together like he needed and get the crew together. And, they didn't do that well. And then, Dale basically bailed out. And then when Richard called me, he says, I'll go to meet Richard in his shop in Winston, or actually Welcome, North Carolina. And he says, "Hey," I said, "Richard, how many races can you run?" He says, "Well, I've got enough money. If we go to Daytona and we do really well," he says, "we can maybe run 6 races." And so I said, "Well, 6 is better than none." So yeah, I'm on board. And he says, "But if something comes along, we're going to try to run a season." So we get started, getting ready to go to Daytona. About a week before Daytona, he gets a call from the Piedmont Airlines guys and said, "Hey, we're going to like to put the money up and have you carry our colors." So it all kind of came together, and Richard started building his team. And in the first year, we sat on I think the first race, we sat on a pole at Daytona. We didn't win the pole. We outside pole, and Cale turned upside down qualifying. And so we were outside pole. We got moved to the pole that day. And I think we won the first 4 poles of the year that year in a row. I think we won Rockingham, Bristol, Daytona, inherited Daytona, but considered a pole. But there's another one. The first 4 poles of the year, I believe, in 1982, we won those first 4 poles. Might have been Riverside then. Might have been the first race. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
It was.
And that's how that was the other race. So anyway, it just started clicking, and then we blew a lot of motors that year, broke a lot of motors. Come out the next year, switched to Chevrolet, and we won 2 races that year and did well. Still had some engine problems. I think I can't remember. We broke some motors and stuff. Back then, that was not all that uncommon to break motors, but it seemed like we broke them at inopportune times.
Yeah.
So anyway, we won Martinsville. I think we won Riverside that year.
Yeah.
And we're all set to go. Looking good. The season's winding down, and then I get a call. Actually, Mike Curb told me that hey, they just hired Earnhardt to drive your car. I said, "What?" I said, "Yeah, he's going to drive the 3 car." And I didn't know about it until Mike Curb told me about it.
Really?
Yeah. At Charlotte. It's October in Charlotte. That's when I found out about it. It was a big letdown, big disappointment, obviously. But, hey, that's, stuff happens, move on.
Well, that first win, that was at Riverside.
Yeah.
Yes.
Am I correct? Well, first, for the obvious question is, how did you feel to finally take that checkered flag?
Oh, I really liked driving for Richard. Linda, my wife, was on the pit crew. And Richard took care of his people. Just real quick, on the end of the year, she gets a bonus check in the mail. And well, Richard, what's this for? She said, "Well, you keep pit laps. You're in the sun. You're down there helping fuel mileage, and you're working. You're part of this crew." She says, "Well, yeah, but that's for the guys." He said, "You're right in there with them. This is your cut. No, I'm not going to argue with this. Take that money and go." It wasn't. It was in the 100 category, but still, the thought of it, to include her in on that. But the first win. Let's go back. I think when I first came to Richard, it might have been the winter 82, getting ready to go into the 83 season. They used to have a race at Texas Motor Speedway. And it was outlaw race, whatever you want to call it, but we raced against, I'm thinking Terry Labonte might have been driving in that race at that time. It had been his Texas operation. It wasn't, when he had the big time stuff. But I think Neil Bonnet was there. Bobby Allison ran. But it's kind of a stopover point. Seemed like we'd run the West Coast and stop in Texas on the way back. Anyway, we stopped in there. And we ended up winning a race at Texas College Station. It used to be a cup track, and then at that time it came off the schedule. But it was considered a big non-NASCAR event. And we won that race. And Richard found out later. He said you were almost there, but your confidence wasn't there. I had to show you that you could win, and you had to have a taste of it. And really that helped. And we came out the next year. We won 2 races. So, it was a neat place. And as far as victory lane the first time, it changed a little bit because I remember winning, and we had a pretty dominant car that day. But there was no victory lane. The cables for the cameras wouldn't reach to where the victory lane was set up, so we had to stop in the middle of the racetrack on pit road and do the victory lane get together there. But I mean, it's nothing like the first win. But it was a big day for sure.